something I can tell everyone: if you're ever invited by Daniel, then it is impossible not to disappoint, because he always makes such sweet and generous endorsements at the beginning that you can only fail the standards that are set. So I'm going to start disappointing first by admitting that I am actually going to talk about Benjamin's essay. And second, I want to just do the technology check, like, can you hear me okay? Is it loud enough? Otherwise, please interrupt me. I'll find my way back in. Okay. So the title which Daniel suggested for this talk, and that he already mentioned before, an upheaval that this kind of strike not so much causes but consummates, is one of the names Benjamin gives to revolution. I think it's a name for revolution which Benjamin not so much found but sought in the proletarian general strike. That brings me to the central claim I'm trying to convince you of tonight, namely that only a feminist general strike, or better, an active abolitionist feminist strike, can satisfy Benjamin's own criteria for revolution. I'm trying to, even though Daniel gave this generous license, I will try not to present this as an external suggestion or addition, but from an immanent reconstruction of Benjamin's essay. Martin Saar, in his commentary on Benjamin's essay, Critique of Violence, said that within it, Benjamin displayed, and as Saar says, quote, outright proximity to theological topoi, which, however, are not reformulated materialistically, but categorically integrated into Benjamin's political thought as erratic blocks. And he's talking about the discussion of mythical and divine violence here. He says they're kind of wedged into Benjamin's thinking non-materialistically as erratic blocks. And I want to suggest that they needed to be, because the materialism of Benjamin's day lacked the categories for a secular reformulation of what he sketches as mythical and divine violence. But maybe the materialism of our days, if it is a decolonial and feminist and informed materialism, does not. So the core of my attempt here will therefore be a reinterpretation of mythical violence and divine violence in feminist terms, suggesting that we can understand mythical violence better with the use of Rita Segato's term of a pedagogy of cruelty, and divine violence with Veronica Gago's concept of the feminist general strike and feminist potentia. Before this reinterpretation, however, I think it's good to take a step back and recount a bit. I mean, Daniel has already beautifully introduced the essay, but why Benjamin gets to those weird terms, mythical and divine violence, at all in the project of his essay. So it's commonly and rightly said that the critique of violence Benjamin presents is a critique in the sense of discrimination. So he tries to draw distinctions within the concept and the different shapes that the phenomenon of violence, distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate violence, and also within the set, especially of illegitimate violences, distinctions between different forms. Famously the law-making and law-preserving violence. But I want to emphasize that there's also an additional kind of pair of distinctions that his critique is seeking and driven by, and that's the distinction between effective and ineffective violence. So his desideratum in the essay is illegitimate, and it will turn out to be legitimate, it has to be non-violent violence, so illegitimate, but also an effective form of violence. And now to discern the legitimate side of it, to say when violence is legitimate, Benjamin rules out right at the outset, as many of you will know, a very sort of normal or self-suggesting way of judging violence, which is by looking at their means and looking at what they serve to. Benjamin thinks that can only lead to terror, both when we find all legal violence justified as long as it kind of serves to fulfill the end of the law, because then we will have a kind of terrible police state, but also for his kind of core question of revolutionary violence. So if we say the violence is always justified if only it leads to a better state, something that, for instance, Marcuse comes close to arguing in his later essay, Ethics and Revolution, then the terror and the authoritarian kind of takeover of the revolution is already programmed into it. So we cannot settle the question of the legitimacy by looking at the ends. We have to analyze, says Benjamin, the means as such. Now, if he found out that the legal means of violence are legitimate, then of course there wouldn't be any use for revolution. But you will be not surprised to hear that, of course, he does think that there is such a thing as legal violence, very grave violence, and distinguishes two forms: the law-making violence, so violence that is needed to inaugurate and then set law. So, for instance, you need a whole war to then establish a contract of which order shall reign. And also then the second form is the law-preserving violence, where in order to uphold those laws that are anyway brought about by violent means, then you need agencies that partly stand outside the law and have kind of unlawful or extra-legal authority and leeway to judge in how to enforce the law by violent means. So that's the law-preserving violence. Since those two, according to Benjamin, are given in our societies, he concludes that revolution is a necessity. If we want to live in a non-violent world, we have to overcome the whole legal regime we live in. He also points to a sort of stepping stone for that overcoming from within the legal order, namely the right to strike, which is a kind of given legitimate right that we have. And Benjamin says that if employed in the right way, as proletarian general strike, this right to strike can serve to overturn the whole order. I quote him: the proletarian general strike as a pure means is non-violent. It takes place not in readiness to resume work following external concessions and thus this or that modification of working conditions, but in the determination to only resume a wholly transformed work, no longer enforced by the state. So he thinks that the general strike is a non-violent, pure form of violence, or purified by its own violent character. So a pure means. Pure also not only from the violence, but also from the instrumentality towards an end, because, and that then now we're back to the title, it doesn't just cause or occasion, as is closer to the German, occasion this change, it already fulfills it, it consummates it in the English translation, or occasions it in the German original. So it's a pure transformative act that fulfills its own aspiration, if it's used in this way that workers withdraw from all segments of production simultaneously and refuse to take up work again unless it's completely transformed, no longer enforced by the state. So in a way, one could think that now we've got it, right? That's what we're looking for. There's the pure means, there's the general strike as revolution, ticked. And I feel that sometimes Benjamin's essay is also presented as if that were his conclusion. But as I read him, the proletarian general strike only ticks the legitimacy side of revolutionary violence. So it is a pure means. But it kind of, Benjamin is very hesitant about its efficacy. So whether that general strike will actually be enough to really consummate it itself, to really overturn the order. So there are two arguments which Benjamin brings up for why this will probably not work. The first is that the general strike, even if non-violent by Benjamin's categorical framework, is of course seen as very violent by the state. I mean, that's the whole point of it, right? If you want to overturn the state, of course the state's going to find that violent. But that will trigger a backlash and a kind of reaction and a police brutality that is very likely to squash the strike. That's sort of the political side of its powerlessness. Then there's also an economic side of the kind of powerlessness of the general strike, which is in this beautiful phrase that Benjamin makes, where he says that the economy of the day, and this is only more true for the economy of our days, but the economy of his day is not so much a machine that is brought to a halt if sort of its operator steps away, as the striking workers would, but it's more a beast that runs wild in the absence of its keeper. So it might be that even though everybody steps out of production, that in some way the economy might still reel, and it's something that we've also seen in some aspects of the COVID shutdowns, that then still like somehow the share values rise, even though a lot of production is halted. So from those 2 points, Benjamin concludes that it's not that easy with the nonviolent strategy. So it's on page 247 of his essay. I quote, "Since every conceivable solution to human problems, not to speak of deliverance from the confines of all the world historic conditions of existence obtaining hitherto, remains impossible if violence is totally excluded in principle, the question necessarily arises as to what kinds of violence exist other than all those envisaged by legal theory, and also other than the ones he has envisaged so far in his text, because now he opens up a kind of new set of violences, those which are no longer means, not even pure means as the general strike is, but new forms of violence which are manifestations. Those he also wants to distinguish and critique, and the two types he sets out are mythical and divine violence, both of which he thinks aren't even means, they are manifestations of something. And I'm going to talk about that in much more detail in a bit. Those two forces are often kind of tucked away in interpretations of Benjamin. So there's this tendency that mythical violence is just equated with the lawmaking violence, and it will become apparent later why that is so. So it's just another way, it's kind of a more allegorical, kind of metaphorical, weird Greek quoting way of saying that there's always violence at the beginning, at the inauguration of laws. We know that already. So that's how that's often folded away. For instance, Menke does that in his interpretation. But then divine violence, that's what Benjamin closes his essay with, is often treated as a bit of an embarrassment. It's kind of like so shocking how Benjamin speaks of a pure annihilating violence, and mythical violence is kind of striking, bloody violence, divine violence is a lethal but non-bloody violence, whatever that may be. So that's sort of not nice, and it's usually dealt with in a way that if it's not wholesale rejected, it's partly rejected. And my favorite interpreters of Walter Benjamin, as in Daniel Leuk and Judith Butler, then partly translate divine violence into communication. They kind of dissolve it or translate it into translation and into communicative means, like also the negotiations you would have in councils, or the anarchist tool of that Kropotkin suggests of free agreements as opposed to kind of legal contracts. And there are also examples that Benjamin makes about talking about diplomacy and extra-legal conflict resolution and sort of civil cases, which definitely sort of suggest that that is a valid interpretation. But I'm going to try a different strategy nevertheless, and try to say that mythical violence is something like the kind of power, is sort of subjectivating power, and divine violence is the allocation and withholding of care. And I see how much I can convince you of that, but first I will go through both forms, quickly say how Benjamin introduces them, then try to convince you that there's a plausible reading in this kind of feminist version that I suggest. And then in closing, we will end up with the feminist strike, and I'll walk through two dilemmas that I think it raises. So first, mythical violence. Benjamin says that mythical violence is not a means but a manifestation. Actually, when he starts talking about it, it's either a manifestation of the existence of God or of the existence of male anger. So that already gives you one clue. But his actual allegorical figure from which he kind of then abstracts the concept is the story of Niobe in Ovid's Metamorphosis. So Niobe is one of the Tantalides, and she boasts about her fertility. So she has 10 sons and 10 daughters, and so she walks around like, look, like I was like coming endless abundance. And then she's punished by Apollo and Artemis, but who find this kind of completely arrogant and annoying, and also who are childless themselves. They punish her, kill all the kids, 20 kids, 10 sons, 10 daughters. Don't kill her, but then make her kind of turn into a stone because she's so bereft and in her mourning, she just sort of petrifies. And it's important for Benjamin's presentation of this example that it's not that she's punished because she has broken a law. So this is not like law-preserving violence. Apollo and Artemis are not the police, but she's caused something that upset them so much that a line was drawn that wasn't previously there. So I quote Benjamin's description of this. He says, "Violence therefore bursts upon Niobe from the uncertain, ambiguous sphere of fate. It is not actually destructive, although it brings a cruel death to Niobe's children. It stops short of claiming the life of their mother, whom it leaves behind more guilty than before through the death of the children, both as an eternally mute bearer of guilt and as a boundary stone on the frontier between men and gods." I think you can already see shine through some options of interpreting this in a feminist way. I think the Brazilian feminist and anthropologist Rita Segato's analysis of patriarchal violence has particularly strong resonances here. So Rita Segato says that there is a primordial form of violence that is patriarchal violence, and what it consists in is, in her words, a pedagogy of cruelty. And by pedagogy of cruelty, she means two things. She means, A, that everyday life teaches a certain kind of male mandate and prerogative, and also that this is instrumentalized in colonial conquest, in that colonized indigenous male subjects, who also just had that experience of powerlessness and being conquered, are conscripted into the colonizer's world by being kind of given and taught that mandate of cruelty that over women, over kind of the indigenous women who suffer from this. And the pedagogy of cruelty for her is not just a kind of repertoire of violent actions, but she really describes it as a kind of mode of reification. So what the pedagogy of cruelty does, in her words, is that it turns relations into things and life into death. And now with Niobe, we have exactly such a process where the kind of living, abundantly fertile woman is turned into a stone to mark a boundary. And that's a boundary that I think can both be seen according to a logic of racialization, where the sort of racialized, perhaps indigenous reproductivity is banned, even sort of genocidally punished and extinguished. But also, of course, it's a gendering violence which disowns and then petrifies the reproductive power of Niobe and leaves her feeling sort of guilty in a way that she couldn't ever have anticipated. So now this kind of violence, of mythical violence that sets up the boundary that is Niobe, could be just seen as a kind of like illustration or a kind of imaginal way of repeating the point that a new law has been brought into the world. After all, it seems that there is now this kind of law: if you're fertile, don't boast about it, or don't tempt the gods, or something. But I think we have to look closer at the concept of lawmaking in order to pry apart an aspect that is new and that you only get with mythical violence and not with Benjamin's previous discussion of lawmaking. And this is the aspect of what he calls power making. So I quote his analysis: at this very moment of lawmaking, the violence especially establishes as law, not an end unalloyed by violence, but one necessarily and intimately bound to it, under the title of power. So this link to violence becomes unresolvable. Lawmaking, he continues, is power making, assumption of power, and to that extent, an immediate manifestation of violence. Power is the principle of all mythic lawmaking. And I think the specificity of the mythical lawmaking over the kind of lawmaking we had before in war is that it's not fully channeled into laws. It doesn't just create or posit the rule, it also creates or petrifies the object or the subject of law, in the sense of the one who is subject to laws. So there is a kind of identity formation or subjectification that happens in the mythical violence that is kind of more than just lawmaking. And one way to fit this into an expanded interpretation of Benjamin is opened up by Daniel's work, because Daniel, in his book Critique of Sovereignty, which also is now available in English, has, I would almost say famously, definitely famous to me, expanded the list of legal violences beyond Benjamin's counting of the two, from lawmaking and law preserving. So that with Daniel, we also have, so we have law preserving, then we have law positing rather than lawmaking. We also have law withholding, law interpreting, and law splitting violence. And I think that the Benjamin's original lawmaking violence could nicely be kind of split into, on the one side, what Daniel calls law positing violence, but additionally into something that I would maybe call law priming violence. So the violence that molds the objects of law into a certain shape that in the first place makes it possible that they fall under law's reach, that they become legible to law. In my my own work, I would call this law priming violence, also propertizing violence. So violence that encloses subjects into ongoing objecthood, and so puts that sort of abundant figure Niobe into a stone. But the important thing is that this law priming violence, it doesn't just it creates something else than just law-bearing sovereign individuals. It also creates law-primed individuals that are always already on the wrong side of law, and that I think are also needed to display to play a role in the law preserving violence. So the police need certain objects that are or subjects that are primed in a way that they can always be found guilty and that they can always be policed. Like this, they can even be extinguished, as in the example with Nairobi's children. And this kind of subject position of being always already guilty is, of course, one in which patriarchy pushes women. And to conclude this, I want to quote to you from actually an activist text from Chile by the Las Tesis collective. And in one of their performances, so that they have those very famous performances in the Menos strikes and demonstrations. And the text of one from last May starts with the line, "Patriarchy is a courthouse. We are found guilty in by birth. Being born with a vulva or dissident in all possible facets is fatefully tied to brutality. Everything patriarchy touches turns into brutality. God is definitely a man. And we impeach his misogyny, a hatred of women which runs through our history, defames us, covers us with death." So that I just think is a kind of, I just love this description of what I mean by the pedagogy of violence priming some subjects into things or with death. But we're also getting ahead of ourselves a bit, because with Las Tesis, with the resistance, we already enter the realm of divine violence, or so I will argue, for Benjamin. As for any feminist, mythical violence, first of all, reinforces the quest for a counterforce or for a remedy. And I think this remedy is not already delivered by the proletarian general strike. That's why Benjamin himself ends the discussion of mythical violence with a reiterated call for actually somewhat for violent revolution. So he says the task of destruction poses itself again, and ultimately the question of a pure, immediate violence that might be able to call a halt to mythic violence. And this violence that calls a halt to mythical violence is what Benjamin discusses under this mysterious heading of divine violence. So Benjamin turns to divine violence as the antidote to mythical violence, and as the supplement that will allow the strike to overcome legal violence, to be powerful enough. So it has those both functions. He illustrates this again with a classical reference, in this case from the Torah. And he uses God's judgment on the company of Korach, so in the Exodus Moses story. He summarizes this in the following words: God's judgment strikes privileged Levites, striking them without warning, without threat, and does not stop short of annihilation. So not nice. You can see why maybe one should be a bit careful with that category. But I want to question a bit more what is actually happening in this biblical story that Benjamin brings up here. So the Levites, led by Korach, challenged Moses and Aaron's authority, and then Moses and Aaron suggest a particular settlement to that dispute. They suggest that each of the feuding parties should settle in separate encampments. And crucially, that they should have two separate hearth fires, so the kind of cooking arrangement. And then after they've done that, suddenly the ground opens and swallows the whole Kodak and his company, so the whole group, they just disappear in the ground. So are vanished. It's interesting, sort of in the English translation, it says the company of Kodak, so we have some capitalist sort of connotations here. Quite some companies I would like to vanish in the ground. But in the German text, Benjamin actually speaks of Rotte, so that's a rout or a mob. It has much more it's more like a fascist collectivity that you would hear the resonances of. Which is also no surprise, because shortly before Benjamin wrote the text, there was the one and biggest ever German general strike, which was called to halt the Kapp-Putsch, which was a right-wing militia coup that was trying to sort of already in 1921 to overturn the democratic, sort of social democrat-led Weimar Republic into fascism. And that was actually stopped by a general strike, but of course, the general strike didn't consummate the overcoming of the order of law in any further way. So we could read the company of Kodak in that way, but we could also stick with the company meaning, because in the Quran, actually, the Kodak is a character who boasts about his riches. So it's a bit the equivalent to Niobe, but instead of boasting about fertility, Kodak boasts about all his property and belonging, and then gets swallowed by the earth. So there you can already nicely see this kind of, well, try to eat your money. If all care is subtracted from your camp, then you will just wither away. But we do, like, I don't even think we need to necessarily take Moses' side here. After all, as revolutionaries, there should be some sympathy to the egalitarian, like, attempts of the questioning the authority of Moses and Aaron. But we could then still say that the Korach uprising is a failed revolution, maybe a revolution that didn't get its care and reproduction right. So I'm thinking of Silvia Federici's discussion in her Feminist Revolution and the Commons article, where she talks very sort of suddenly about the hobos and says that that was a movement in the early 20th century in North America, where lots of people sort of had made an exodus from the institution of wage work, and also households, and mostly men who were kind of tramping around and trying to be vagrant and not to do wage work, but that actually couldn't be sustainable or didn't last because they couldn't cook, like they couldn't look after themselves and form households and form that kind of feminist comments that Federici, who of course also influenced the Latin American women's movement that I'm going to turn to in a second very strongly, envisaged as crucial for revolution. So whichever way we turn it, this story or this scenery that Benjamin chooses for his illustration of divine violence is one where there is a withdrawal happening. It actually even kind of brings up again the definition he gives earlier of the general strike, that is actually an omission of an action or service that amounts to severing of relations. And that is what makes it so non-violent or pure, means that it actually withdraws or cuts the link. So the withdrawal of reproduction from an unjust or cruel regime could be seen as such a severing of relations. And it can actually translate, if sort of reproduction is withdrawn from something, it can translate into fateful, even fatal, non-regeneration. So if we try to see divine violence that way, then the somewhat bizarre list of attributes that Benjamin churns out in his juxtaposition of mythical and divine violence, I think starts to make a bit of sense. So he describes it in that way. Divine violence is the antithesis to mythic violence in all respects. If mythic violence is lawmaking, divine violence is law destroying. So by that one group withering, no new law is set into place. There isn't also a boundary. It's just that there's a void. And that's also how he goes on. If the former So if mythical violence sets boundaries, the latter boundlessly destroys them. So with Niobe and the Pedagogy of Cruelty, we have this enclosure of identities, the priming of subjects into the enclosure, into boundaries. With divine violence, those boundaries get destroyed, and the kind of reified care is sort of spilled over, but also withdrawn from those who propertized and appropriated it. If mythical violence brings at once guilt and retribution, divine power only expiates. So we saw Niobe feeling very, very guilty of the sort of death of her children, and also of that newly learned, like violating that newly learned manifestation of the kind of jealous gods that you mustn't provoke. So this sort of situation of always being on the wrong side of law, always being found guilty, is turned into a new sort of freed and liberated stance where that guilt is dissolved. And I think it's important that it's dissolved in that the reification or the kind of victim or kind of wrongness status of the oppressed is lifted. But if divine power strikes, then also the guilt of the oppressor is dissipated. You know, if you have a proper feminist strike and, you know, the macho men just don't get looked after anymore, they cannot appropriate reproduction anymore. They're also not guilty. I mean, it's not even clear whether there'll be men in the conventional terms of sense anymore. It's sort of expiated. Then Benjamin goes on, as the former threatens, so the mythical violence threatens, the latter strikes. If the former is bloody, the latter is lethal without spilling blood. And I mean, I don't think that can be the crucial criterion, but it is like weirdly the case that withholding of care, I mean, I've been seeing this super cute baby of Jacob there, withholding of care can of course be a terribly like cruel and violent act, but it's not a bloody one. So mythic violence is bloody power over mere life for its own sake. Divine violence is pure power over all life for the sake of the living. That's a very enigmatic formulation, and having just written a book that is called Revolution for Life, I think I would also like to delve deeper into what Benjamin does with this qualification of mere life versus the living. And I think that that further calls for a care-oriented perspective that is also able to distinguish between like this boasting of Niobe. Somehow that can't just be reproduction, to just be kind of proud that you have all those offsprings. There must be something more sort of targeted, or some connection of reproduction with the causes of justice. And also, I mean, Benjamin also refers to that, all the other cycles of life, like animal life, vegetable life, the kind of upholding of the shared life. That's where the sacredness of life is, not just the individual preservation of life. That of course we also have at the foundation of contract theories that Benjamin is precisely trying to set up an alternative to. But I leave that aside and just bring up one more little tiny piece of scrap of evidence that Benjamin himself moves on to give sort of everyday secular reading of divine power, where he says this divine power is not only attested by religious tradition, but it's also found in present day life in at least one sanctioned manifestation, the educative power, which in its perfected form stands outside the law and is one of its manifestations of divine violence. So that's interesting. That is already the realm of reproduction. To complete the contrast between mythical and divine violence, we can return to the illustrations. Mythical violence petrifies, Niobe turns to stone. Divine violence opens the ground, exploits the stone. And I'm going to read you now a passage from Veronica Gago, where she describes the inauguration, or the outbreak, birth of the feminist strikes And I want you to imagine that boundary stone into which Niobe was turned and how it cracks open and erupts. The essay is also called The Earth Trembles. So, and here's Gago. A sound of vibrations, not the sound of words, was what brought together the massive vibrating collective body under the rain when we organized the first National Women's Strike on October 19, 2016. It was the kind of cry that is made by a blow to the mouth in a quagmire that disorganizes the body and moves it in new connected ways of breathing. The October 16 strike was the first women's strike in Argentina's history, although it quickly ceased to be solely national. We brought the country to a stop during 1 hour when we were all coordinated, but we did so throughout the day as well, in 1,000 different and interconnected ways. We made time tremble. Throughout the day, we avoided doing anything that wasn't organizing ourselves in order to be together. We realized that in various places in the world, thousands of women were knit together by the need for mobilization, the need to escape from the confinement into which we were forced by private mourning. And even though that I would already be happy with that as the last word, I want to just wrap up by walking you through two possible dilemmas of this interpretation in 4 minutes. I think I still have it, should be fine. That maybe kind of unravel this interpretation again, or at least suggest quite some counter evidence. Because one problem of this this kind of vision of a feminist general strike, of a reproduction strike, is of course that it is really not clear how non-violent it is, and it could be very brutal to withhold care. And we might actually then enter a version of strike that Benjamin rules out and discussed at the beginning of his essay, namely the doctor's strike. So he talks of medical personnel striking and says, here is revealed as its most repellent and unscrupulous use of violence, which is positively depraved. So that's obviously something that feminist strike would also have to deal with, to be called positively depraved. And there is this whole dilemma that certain types of care work are very hard, if not impossible, to withhold. And I think this can only be resolved if we turn one step further than just the severing of relations, turn more to the kind of making of the hearth fire in the biblical story. And Veronica Gago discusses this in a, I think, very beautiful passage about the March 8th strike in 2018, where she talks of a collective that is doing a soup kitchen in Buenos Aires in one of the slum neighborhoods. And the women there say they would like to strike, but also they don't want to not distribute food to the children on the day of the strike. And then they make a sign where they say, "Ni una menos, today we only serve raw food, no cooked food." So there is a way found of how you can kind of withhold the work and yet still do the feeding. And one step further than that, we could also think about whether or not the feeding of the poor is itself a form of strike. It's a building of kind of new caring relations kind of on the side of the formerly oppressed, and that would then turn the strike into what Gustav Landauer has called for as an active general strike. So Landauer thought, like what I also paraphrased from Benjamin, that there would be no chance of succeeding with a standard general strike because the capitalists can just wait it out and eventually the workers will have to go back to work unless they organize themselves. And Benjamin actually also speaks explicitly of soup kitchens. They organize themselves and their reproduction in a way that makes them last sort of forever, definitely for as long as it takes for the capitalists to be swallowed by the ground and just join the soup kitchens. which is also the advice that Gago gives to men who wanted, like there was even one union leader who first was very opposed to the idea of the feminist strike, was like, you're not a form of employment, you can't strike, blah, blah. And then in the end, he was convinced enough to actually do the cooking so that the women could hold an assembly. The second, so precisely those very kind of nice and powerful stories maybe bring with them too much of a deviation from what I find very fascinating in Benjamin, namely the valorization of passivity. So there's a certain, like, you know, I'm here talking about this amazingly powerful Latin American feminist strike movement, almost sort of making it into a mythical thing myself, whereas like around here, like the German feminist movement is not organizing anything of the sort. And in fact, if the kind of German left at the moment is characterized by anything, it's fatigue. I mean, for instance, one of the actually most vibrant movements, Ende Gelände, has just made a formal resolution in their last big plenary that they will have a time of no action, of focusing on the kind of internal care structures, of trying to fix the problem that it's mostly women who do the structural work on the movement, and the men always want an action, but it's actually the women who do the logistics behind it. And so if they called off all resistance for self-reflection. And also Tajo Müller, one of the people at the forefront of the climate movement, has just issued a set of articles and interviews where he said he's just tired, nothing works, he'll just stop, he's not going to do anything. I also, having written this book about social movements, get really moving letters from readers who say that the thing that they found most touching was the idea that we're just all totally burned out, like nature, and us like likewise fatigued. So I think one also needs to think the reproductive strike not just from the point of view of, whoa, we have all this powerful upheaval, but more like, how can we withdraw what power, how does it maybe open the ground if a whole generation of kind of millennials is so disaffected by the promises of the system and of career and of even the promise of cool militant action, that they're just like wanting to stay at home and look after themselves, or ideally each other. Does that have any explosive power, or is that just proof that the revolution is happening elsewhere, which might of course also be the case. In any case, to sort of try to capture any potential in those moments of severing of relations and that sort of version of exodus into burnout, we need to probably reverse the order, sort of build the hearth fire first so that we may live, and then remove ourselves, hoping that the absence will be noted. And that's also something that Veronica Gago quotes over and over again from the women who participate in the strike, that they say, I want people to notice that I'm not there. When I'm there, I'm not even noticed, but my absence, the absence of my labor might be noticed. So in this spirit, I'm tired. Here it ends. Thank you for listening.